Welcome to another Argan Solutions podcast. It's the first one of 2022. Woohoo! And we're really lucky to be joined again by Johnny Gowdy from Regen Southwest. Hi, Johnny.
Hi, Fraser. Happy New Year.
Yeah, you too. You too. Hopefully, it is going to be a good one. I know personally we've got the biggest event of 2022 coming up in the next couple of weeks for us. Can you guess what that is?
I can't really know.
No, it's the Totnes pantomime. Oh, yes, it is.
Oh, no, it isn't.
That's what I'm really excited about.
So what part have you got, Fraser?
Unfortunately, I didn't get my favourite part, which was Tinkerbell, because it's Peter Pan this year. I'm just a minor pirate, but that's okay. But being a little bit more serious, 2022, I think, is going to be a really interesting year in the energy space. And I think we thought that maybe it'd be quite good to kind of start maybe by just having a little look back at 2021.
Yeah, I mean, the end of 2021, the last 6 months, kind of ended with a bit of a flurry. I mean, on the policy side, we had the net zero strategy published, and we finally had the heat and building strategy published. So a lot of commitments, a lot of new targets, a lot of new policies being signposted, if not delivered across the UK. And of course, we had COP26, so a huge amount of focus on climate change, carbon decarbonisation, and obviously energy as well. So some real high points at the end of the year, and then to some extent the fly in the ointment, or at least the excitement, was created by the changes in gas prices. And we are still in something of an energy crisis at the moment, with rocketing gas wholesale prices, and a number of reasons behind that, including some of the politics with Russia, etc. The knock-on impact that had on electricity prices, and again a flurry of energy supply companies going bust, which has set us up, I wouldn't say nicely, for 2022. I mean, we are still facing that energy price crisis, and it's going to be very interesting to see how the government responds to that.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because in a way, we've got all these huge commitments, and I'm going to talk just predominantly about electric prices because we're talking about moving to a more electrified kind of energy network. But we've got all these commitments, and then we're worrying about really high prices, and we need to worry about on one side because it's a kind of there's a kind of well-being and sort of state of people being able to heat their homes or power their homes. There's a kind of social issue, with that pricing. But on the other hand, these high prices are actually also a great signal for investment in on-site renewables, right? If suddenly your price is moving from 15 to 20% 20 pence plus, suddenly the rates of return on solar and also on wind, when it's connected on a private wire, suddenly become really interesting, right?
I think that's right. I mean, everyone that has put solar on their roofs must be, very pleased at the moment when they see the price of electricity. And even if you can't invest directly in renewables yourself, then taking out a long-term contract via power purchase agreement to buy renewables is a really good hedge. And I think a lot of, local authorities and businesses will be thinking about buying renewables directly. And so, I mean, the fundamental message is, if fossil fuel prices are very high, there ought to be an accelerated shift towards renewables.
So if I'm with, let's say, an energy company that proposes that they are 100% renewable, so like Good Energy or somebody like that, and everybody's talking about fossil fuel prices driving this rise in energy prices. Does that mean if I'm with a renewable energy business that my prices are all also going to go up significantly, or am I kind of disengaging from that story?
Well, gosh, that's a complicated one. It does depend a little bit. I mean, Good Energy is an example of a company that does actually source the overwhelming majority of its electricity from renewables, but it's still subject to the changes in the electricity wholesale price. And the electricity wholesale price at the margin is set by the price of gas, the gas
Mm.
generators, because the wholesale price will tend to track the gas price. I mean, if we look to the future where fossil fuels have a minimal role in the electricity system, then you would expect those wholesale prices to much more reflect the cost of renewables. But at the moment, we're still in a world where it's the gas price that's setting the electricity price. I mean, the way to insulate yourself from those price rises in the very short term is to do what you suggest, which is try to find ways of generating your own electricity or buying electricity directly yourself, so you're avoiding those wholesale price changes. And of course, the old favorite that we always forget about is energy efficiency. So really, that's what we should be doing first, is trying to limit our dependency on energy full stop.
It is really interesting, isn't it? When we talk about the climate issue, we always sort of default to energy generation as a because in some ways it's kind of the easiest thing, isn't it? You put some panels on your roof, generates electricity, it mitigates what you're using on site when you're using it, or exports to the grid, and we can sort of get our head around that. Whereas energy efficiency, actually, when you look at it, okay, changing light bulbs is fairly easy, and we can understand that. But actually, when you get down into energy efficiency at other levels, it becomes quite complicated, about working out how much you will save by double glazing, secondary glazing,
Yeah.
through insulation. What will that actually save me, et cetera, et cetera. And I
And
think that's always been the problem with energy efficiency. And I think for 2022, actually, one thing I'd really like to see is, like you say, raising the bar about how we talk about and how we communicate energy efficiency, and how we actually start to bring that into this discussion and its importance.
absolutely, Fraser. I mean, if 2022, is a year of delivery on the back of these commitments and promises that have been made, then energy efficiency is one of those areas where we really need to see, I mean, a step change in terms of how we deploy energy efficiency projects. I mean, there is a scandal here, which is that for the last sort of 40, 50 years, we have continued to build substandard housing, and we've let developers get away with that. And other countries, Germany, for example, also faces very high energy costs, but the impact for their consumers is so much less because their homes are so much better insulated.
I was looking at their energy prices actually for a client, and they pay sort of almost double what we pay. I mean,
Yeah,
sort of 30 plus cents per kilowatt hour. We'd be up in arms over here if we were paying what
absolutely.
Germany pays.
But it has a significantly lower impact in
Mhm.
Germany because most homes in Germany are so much better insulated and have so much more efficient.
Mhm.
So it's less of an issue. Now, we have taken a big risk in the UK, basically going for cheap energy and low efficiency. And now that's come back to bite us because the cheap energy is gone and we're left with the low efficiency.
Yeah, yeah. So bring back sort of Code 6 building regulations that were kind of dumped. God, what was
Yeah.
it, 10 years ago or whenever it was?
And at the moment, we're not looking to see any major changes in new buildings until 2025, which is at
Crikey.
least 10 years late. I mean, we should have done this, 2015.
So going back to your original point, we had all these commitments last year. What are the big inflection points in 2022 where we're going to see the opportunity for renewables to really make their mark?
It's really interesting. We've been doing quite a lot of analysis on the pipeline of projects. So we're doing some work at the moment with Western Power Distribution, who are the network operators in the southwest of England and the Midlands, and also with Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, who cover the south and the north of Scotland. And they're very interested to know, how quickly our project's going to come forward. So what is the kind of forward view of project delivery? And one of the things that we have recognized is that there is actually a huge pipeline of projects that are waiting in the wings, if you like. And when you analyze those, you look to see, have they got a grid connection? And the answer for a lot of them is yes. Have they got planning? The answer for a lot of them is yes as well. And I'm talking mainly solar, a lot of battery storage projects, and in the north and in Scotland, a fair number of onshore wind projects. Very few onshore wind projects in England for reasons that are well understood around planning. And we're talking gigawatts of projects that could come forward very, very quickly. So one question is, well, why haven't they been built to date? And I think that the problem post subsidy has been mainly around confidence of revenue and the inability of these projects to get finance. And as we've just been talking about, with the massive jump in electricity prices, all of a sudden that confidence is returning, and I think that these projects will go forward in the next 12 months, 18 months. If they don't go forward in the next 12, 18 months, then we've got to really ask ourselves the question, what is wrong with the market at the moment and why are we not seeing investment in renewables? Because this has got to be the year that we see projects actually developed.
And are these all predominantly unconstrained projects, i.e., they don't have to have active network management or grid constraints around them, or are they sort of bound by some kind of connection structure, such as active network management?
There are a substantial minority that are in a constrained area with active network management,
Okay.
which is interesting, and that includes mainly the solar projects that I was talking about and some onshore wind. I actually had the figures. I don't have them off the tip of my tongue, but I want to say that you know we're talking gigawatts of projects that are waiting, and probably up. I think with the solar one was about 8 gigawatts in total. Onshore wind, there's about 4 to 6 gigawatts, and battery storage, something similar. Now, there's always, there will be a fallout from that, and there's lots of speculative projects in there, and a lot of developers will have fluffed up their portfolio, is the expression that we use. So they've got projects in there that are probably not going to go ahead. But when you do dig deep and look at the planning status, look at their network connection, look at activity they may have bid into, recent capacity market auctions or bid into the CFD, these all look like bona fide projects that are quite active.
But why don't you think that they've gone ahead? Because of the market, because of the market
It, the,
price?
the main problem they have around financing is that we're still locked into an old world view that you have to have, a government backed subsidy fit rock CFD for 15 to 20 years. So a lot of investors haven't quite got their head around this kind of post subsidy merchant risk model. But I think that's changing. We've been talking to a couple of banks recently who are now saying that, you know, rather than a subsidy for 15 years, they would be prepared to invest on the back of a long-term power purchase agreement. So let's say a 5-year PPA, which would give them the confidence, the revenue confidence that they need to make that
And
investment.
so just to be really clear, what you're talking about you know, is predominantly large scale in front of the meter projects
Yes,
where they are looking to negotiate. When you talk about a PPA, you're talking about a kind of corporate PPA or a kind of some kind of agreement with somebody to buy that energy specifically, rather than having to sell to the wholesale market. It's pre-bought by somebody.
yes. So they want to, insulate themselves from changes in wholesale prices and the risk that that involves by entering into a long-term power purchase arrangement. And corporate mainly, I mean, that's where the growth area has been. But corporate covers all manner of things. And we're seeing universities, we're seeing local authorities. I mean, any organization that has got a long-term energy demand could enter into a PPA, and that makes a lot of sense from a consumer point of view because it protects them from the spikes and volatility that we're seeing in energy prices.
So, so we've got two things we're talking about here. One is the sort of large scale in front of the meter market, and they require kind of PPAs, long term PPAs, to make those valid. And what it sounds like is there's a load in the wing, and maybe we're still in a position through 2022 moving forward of trying to kind of find a way that the market can tap into that kind of long term PPA. And on the other side, we've got the likes of you and me, and building owners and business, smaller businesses
Yeah.
that are, we quote unquote, behind the meter, who have roof spaces predominantly, let's talk about, where actually we've got solar prices that have dropped by what, 80-90% since say 12-15 years ago. And we've got electricity prices now moving up sort of post 15-20 pence. And actually then the investment opportunity for them is just, it's a slam dunk, right? It's sort of absolutely makes sense as long as they've got the demand to meet the generation that they're putting on their roofs.
The same, yeah, the same logic applies. If you're looking at very high energy prices, then anything you can do to self-generate obviously becomes much more attractive. And all those business cases, we say that the spreadsheets all go green all of a sudden, and suddenly it all makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's what we're expecting. And so 2022 could be a year of massive delivery. We want to see, I mean, we've had a bad 3-4 years really since 2017, where we've seen very little new capacity of renewables being deployed.
Mm.
And we want to see that step change in deployment. And that will have a knock on impact on things like batteries and battery storage, because increasingly we're seeing the co location of renewables and batteries, and that applies to both the in front of the meter and the behind the meter market, as you're describing.
So you talked about CFDs. What's the kind of big date in 2022 for CFDs and renewables then?
So we're in the fourth allocation round for contracts for difference, and notably in this allocation round, a budget has been set aside for the Pot 1 technologies. That's the established technologies, which includes onshore wind and solar. There's also a significant pot for the less established technologies, which includes wave, tidal, and floating wind, with a reserve amount set aside for tidal energy and floating wind. So this is quite a big allocation round. It could set the scene for a number of new contract for different allocation rounds coming through, probably on a yearly or biannual basis over the next decade. The timetable of that at the moment is the bids are in through February and March, and then there's quite a lot of due diligence that goes on. So we won't get the actual result until April at the earliest. And I think they've got a backstop date, which is around about June time. So at that point, we'll know how many companies have actually won through and got their contract for difference.
Where does energy storage sit in those pots that you talked about?
So energy storage doesn't apply for contract for difference. The subsidy that's available for energy storage is the capacity market, which is is on a different timetable. There will be a capacity market auction later on this year, but they don't actually bid in for contracts for difference.
Great. It's just good to clarify that. So you got the CFDs in April, maybe June. Are there any other kind of inflection points this year of significant investment decisions?
Just one last thing to say about the CFDs before we leave it. This time last year, I would have said that the CFDs are absolutely critical to get these projects built. But the way in which the wholesale prices are going, I actually look at the CFDs now and say, well, that's one option, but it does lock you into a relatively low price, the
Hmm.
strike price that you negotiate. And I think a lot of generators might be thinking, well, we're better off not taking a contract for difference, but actually taking our chances that the electricity prices will remain high and selling, on the wholesale price. So I think the CFD is important now, but it's not necessarily the be all and end all that it was a year ago.
That's really interesting. So we've got the CFDs. Any other points of interest throughout 2022 where there might be significant investment decisions?
There isn't one single thing that's going to drive the investment in 2022. There are a number of kind of peripheral things which are quite interesting, and we might come on to it in a minute or two. But in the world of offshore wind and floating offshore wind,
Okay.
where we're going to see some of the lease rounds coming forward. And for us down here in the southwest, of course, we're very interested in what happens in the Celtic Sea. In the case of offshore renewables, the landowner is the Crown Estate. So it is the UK state, in effect, through the agency of the Crown Estate. And the Crown Estate offers up areas of seabed via a leasing process. And so that leasing process is, in effect, the start of a development project. The developers want to get hold of their lease, which is a lease for development, and then they can start the process of doing all the survey work, marine environmental surveys, ground condition surveys, engineering design, etc., that they need in order to put their project forward into planning.
Hmm.
And then, eventually, if the project is successful, securing the finance. So that process actually for offshore renewables is at least 5 years. So it's roughly 5 years from the point of getting your lease to the point at which you could even think about beginning construction. And for many projects, it's been longer than that, 7 or 8 years. So it's a long-term process. And obviously, getting the design of the lease right, understanding which areas of seabed are going to be developed, is a key part in that process. And so for us down here in the Southwest, the big news at the back end of last year from the Crown Estate was that they were intending to offer up 4 gigawatts of lease area in the Celtic Sea for projects that they hope will be built before 2035.
Right. Okay. So basically, it's actually 2022 being kind of the start of people looking to option leases effectively. So I suppose people are given an option on the lease, or do they actually have to purchase the lease?
Well, that's an interesting one. They do have to purchase the lease. They have to. They have to. I won't bore you with the whole process. They have to qualify. There's a bidding process. There's all sorts of hurdles for them to get through. A lot of companies actually form consortia, even at this stage, to go through that process, and they'll probably have their finger in a number of pies in order to sort of make sure that they've got a little bit of a balanced portfolio.
Mm.
But eventually, then they will have to bid for those leases. And in the last bid round, the prices were astronomical. So companies were really spending a lot of money to secure those leases for the future,
Yeah.
which is again interesting. Also interesting to see a whole new batch of companies entering into this market, including some of the oil majors. So we're now seeing BP, Shell, Total, for example, all kind of trying to get into the offshore wind sector.
It feels to me, that if that actually something's not quite right with that. It feels that in a way, as the UK has a commitment to low carbon, and this whole bidding thing between the UK state, Crown Estate, and a load of private companies is kind of like, I don't know, cutting our nose off to spite our face in some ways. It's sort of bidding, 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 like, as you say, putting massive amounts of money down, and kind of to the point where maybe some of these projects are kind of, I don't know, are they viable or sort of touch and go viable? And it feels like maybe the Crown should be saying, right, okay, we've got a load of really, really great engineering expertise in the UK, consortia of UK businesses and non-UK businesses. Let's just get this done. let's, what, and let's just, this whole kind of market-based thing just feels a bit, I don't know, maybe sometimes it feels like it's going against, actually, let's just get this done and let's get it done quickly. And here's a price that works for us, a price that works for you. Let's just all do this.
You're just an old-fashioned socialist, Fraser.
Well,
Like,
I'm
we
an
just we
old-fashioned
just
socialist.
need
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we just need a 5-year plan and crack on.
I do feel sometimes that this whole market-based system that we've got is not necessarily working in our favor to deliver what we need to deliver. That's more of a social climate kind of end goal rather than a money-driven end goal. And I know money has to kind of drive things to some extent, but it feels, listening to you talking about the CFDs, talking about like the whole lease process, talking about volatile wholesale prices. These are all factors that are kind of stopping us potentially from making investment decisions. It feels like we need to shake it up in some way. And I know that probably is not going to happen. We've got to put gigawatts in, right? Let's just do it. Let's
Yeah,
find a way of doing it.
and you're right. In a lot of areas, the market mechanisms that we've kind of invented um, haven't worked. I mean, we've seen a lot of duff policies that haven't actually delivered, and there are unintended consequences of those market mechanisms. I mean, the CFD one for offshore wind. One of the unintended consequences is that we've basically built nearly all of our projects in the southern North Sea because that's the cheapest place to do it, and that's where they've won the auctions. I did a blog just before Christmas called Go West, which was making the argument that we'd be much better off with a diversified wind portfolio and having projects, in the north of Scotland and off the west coast and even across to Ireland. But the CFD auction process really inhibits that, and that's a sort of energy balancing point of view. That the supply chain impacts where UK companies have generally lost out, and I might blame some UK companies for that as well. I mean, they haven't really been particularly active. I mean, where are the Rolls-Royce and the BAE Systems in all of this? If Siemens and GE and Statoil can bid in for these things. Why aren't we seeing UK companies involved? Also agree with you about the whole kind of justice, energy transition. I mean, the market doesn't tend to deliver necessarily the social outcomes that we want to see alongside the energy transition.
So you mentioned one word there, which was supply chain, and so I'm going to be the kind of the fly in the ointment of this kind of potentially positive 2022 in terms of delivering significant renewables. What we're seeing are very, very big supply chain issues. So we know that there's a shortage of a particular type of chip that's actually impacting then the supply of programmable logic computers, or PLCs. That's kind of impacting, things like inverters, and what I'm worried about at the moment is that whether we talk about 2022 and the potential sort of gigawatts of renewables that could be will want to go ahead, but also, when we go back to the wider picture of kind of like, I think they're talking about $5 trillion of investment a year required in energy efficiency and renewables over the next 20, 30 years. The big problem that we have at the moment is that we just can't deliver the kit to enable those. We're all looking at like, we need to get gigawatts of solar and wind, et cetera, et cetera. What nobody's really focusing on is actually this massive underinvestment in the supply chain to actually deliver all the different components that actually go into all of the end product. So just in our little bit that we look at, constraint management is one of our big things. There's a big shortage of PLCs at the moment because of what's going on in the global supply chains, and that means you can't deliver using your normal kit, so you have to then change the control solution that you use for a particular project, which then means that you then have to re-educate and re-update your code for that new platform. And so that brings delays down the line. And then what if those supply chain issues then hit those PLCs and those components? Then you move to another one, and we've got this continual problem at the moment. And so when we're speaking to suppliers, where normally you get kit in a week, in days, at the moment you've got 24-week delivery timelines that are kind of uncertain. My worry for 2022 is that we have this big pipeline of projects, and actually a whole heap of those can't be delivered or will be delayed. There needs to be a discussion now about investing in the supply chain of these critical assets for that zero carbon delivery in 2040, 2050.
I think you're right, Fraser. I mean, it's the same in other industries as well. I mean, what we're seeing, you mentioned the chip issues, which have affecting. It's not just renewables, but any sort of computing, electrical systems, for example. Lithium prices. I was just reading this morning that we've seen actually increase in lithium prices. So we're used to saying renewable costs are dropping, battery costs are dropping, but we might actually see now in the short term, with these supply chain constraints, some increase in some of those component costs, which will have a knock-on impact. And installers as well. I mean, we had a pretty vibrant sector in 2015 with lots of installers of wind and solar and heat pumps, for example. I mean, a lot of those people, left the market because of the dip we saw in installation post subsidy. And the question is, how quickly can we ramp back up again? I have a colleague who tried to get a quote to get a heat pump installed, and she really struggled to find a quote from someone local. I think she had one person in the Southwest, and she ended up getting quotes from people coming down from the Midlands, etc. So, I mean, compare that to getting a boiler put in, a gas boiler put in, where you'd have, a plethora of people on your doorstep that would be qualified to put in a gas boiler. But actually, there's very few people comparatively that can put in a heat pump competently. And that's going to be a real problem for the industry as it ramps up.
So this is kind of like that Green New Deal, the kind of repurposing and reinvestment in, and it has to come really from a governmental perspective in retraining and getting, and creating the infrastructure that enables us to deliver what we need to deliver. If we really took energy efficiency seriously, it would also take the pressure off the supply chain issues in the generation component, because obviously the more energy efficient we are, the hope is the less generation and storage we need as a society to kind of manage the residual energy that we're using.
Absolutely, and that applies to infrastructure as well, and particularly grid and grid constraints, etc. I mean,
Exactly.
the more energy efficient we are, and the smarter we are about when we use energy, the less pressure we're putting on to that infrastructure, which ultimately saves us money. So, I mean, there's a huge amount that we've got to do.
So, in conclusion, we're coming into 2022 with a load of commitments from COP26, which is great. We've got a huge potential supply of low carbon renewable generation in the pipeline, subject to what happens with market pricing in the CFD. We've got a kind of combination of low renewable generation capex and high electricity prices starting to kick in from April this year, which will create a good investment potential behind the meter for kind of on-site rooftop solar. Yet we're moving into a world where actually can we deliver some of these projects if they decide to go ahead, given all the supply chain issues that are kind of emerging at the end of 2021 and into 2022. So it's going to be a kind of a battle of investment case versus supply chain.
I think that's a perfect summary, Fraser. I mean, if I could paraphrase it even further, the market is hotting up, and when we look back at 2022, we want to really see that the impact of that in action. We want to see projects getting delivered. The next time we do our Green Energy Awards, we want to see a plethora of projects bidding in to say that theirs has been the best project delivered over the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Because to be frank, we haven't had that over the last 3 or 4 years. It's been, a lot of planning, a lot of talking, a lot of strategizing, but not enough delivery.
Great. Well, look, Johnny, thank you so much for joining us again. It's been a pleasure to have you on the first podcast of 2022. Thank you, listeners, for listening in. And we're Argan Solutions. Johnny's from Regen Southwest. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Fraser. And I hope I'll get my free tickets to the pantomime.
You've got them
shortly.
Don't worry.
This is a How production. Please follow this podcast and share.